Why does this keep happening to me? Richard's voice cracked, his hand shaking as the spoon slipped from his grasp. You're imagining things, darling, Eleanor whispered, pressing the bowl closer to his lips. But from the corner of the grand dining hall, the maid froze. Her heart pounded. She had seen this before, too many times. Was the billionaire's sickness truly an illness? Or was someone poisoning him under his own roof? Comment your city below. Welcome, story lovers. From where are you watching? Hit the like button and drop your city name in the comments so we can see how far our story travels. The gates of the Winslow estate woke before the sun. They slid apart on hidden tracks with a hush that felt ceremonial, releasing a view of driveways as wide as lanes and hedges clipped to geometric perfection. A fountain in the shape of a ringed planet spilled water into a pool of dark stone, and beyond it waited the mansion, symmetrical and pale, a building that looked less like a home and more like a verdict about what money could make permanent. The staff arrived in staggered waves, their uniforms crisp and movements rehearsed. By the time the first beam of sunlight struck the upper balcony, the house was already breathing. Coffee warming in silver urns, linens steamed flat, glass doors opened just enough to invite air without admitting noise. Richard Winslow belonged to this architecture of precision the way a portrait belongs to a museum wall. He was in his late 50s, tall and spare, a man whose posture had been trained by years of boardroom tables and news cameras. He ran Winslow Global, a complex network of investment arms, logistics companies, and private funds that seemed to span the globe. Newspapers framed him as a builder of bridges between old money and new markets, a strategist whose preferred language was data. People who worked closely with him knew he was also a creature of ritual. He rose early, answered emails with a discipline that resembled prayer, and expected his world to function in reliable, predictable circuits. In public, he projected steadiness. In private, he sought quiet. The mansion arranged itself around that preference. Mornings followed a rhythm almost musical in its predictability. In the dining room, newspapers lay folded in a sculptural stack beside a porcelain cup and a small blue bowl of berries arranged by color. A nutritionist had once recommended the ritual. It never fell out of rotation. On the terrace, a chair faced the hedges at a precise angle because that was where the light struck without glare between 6 and 7. Staff timed steps to the corridor clocks. Security adjusted cameras by a fraction of a degree. The day's first decisions, about meetings, about markets, about which charity would receive which call, traveled outward from that table like ripples, across a surface so polished it seemed depthless. Eleanor Winslow occupied the same rooms as if they were a stage she had designed. She was a decade younger than Richard, meticulous about presentation, fluent in the dialect of legacy. Friends described her as regal. Event planners described her as exacting. She chaired boards that announced scholarships in ballrooms and presided over luncheons where the menu was discussed with more intensity than the cause. Her speeches were a choreography of gratitude and tradition, a promise that standards would be safeguarded and taste would not be diluted. She preferred things labeled and glassed in. She kept a ledger for arrangements as if roses and peonies were assets to be tallied. She favored a particular kind of order that reflected her worldview, one in which lineage determined who was properly at the center and who remained politely peripheral. Grace Daniels entered this clockwork 3 years earlier and learned its rhythms the way a musician learns a score by ear. She was 32, the eldest of 3 siblings, with a memory trained by years of doing a lot with a little. She grew up across town in a neighborhood where sidewalks cracked. She was patched, only to crack again, where neighbors borrowed sugar and jumper cables, and time, where the transit bus announced its approach with a sigh of brakes and the opalescent sheen of diesel that settled on puddles. Her mother worked 2 jobs and raised her children with a gentle insistence on dignity. In that home, chores were not a punishment, but proof that a small space could be kept radiant. Grace absorbed the lesson. She ironed shirts in lines, stacked plates like notes, and taught her hands to listen. She came to domestic work through long detours. She had cleaned offices at night and cared for toddlers whose parents came home late and tired. She had folded towels in a spa that smelled like eucalyptus and demanded. When a recruiter from an agency called about a permanent position on a private estate, steady pay, benefits, and a room on site, she accepted without hesitation. The Winslow house initially astonished her. Everything echoed. The floors reflected faces like shallow ponds. Drawers glided open as if pulled by thought. There were rooms between rooms and doors that led to corridors only the staff used, a reduced scale, infrastructure running beneath the visible one. Grace learned the shortcuts and the systems, the labels behind the labels. She rose before the mansion and walked it awake. It was not just a job to her. It was proof that she could provide stability for the people she loved. Her sister, Mia, was finishing community college with an eye on a career in nursing. Her brother, Jordan, was pursuing an electrician's license while helping their mother, who had spent too many winters standing on aching feet behind supermarket registers. Rent was never on time in the neighborhood unless someone held the line. Grace held it. She sent money twice a month, and family text threads lit up with receipts, schedules, snapshots of soup, and hand-me-down sneakers. On Sundays off, she took the bus back and cooked with her mother, the kitchen fogged with steam and laughter, a small orbit of warmth. Monday morning, she returned to Marble. Within the estate, the hierarchy remained politely explicit. There was a house manager who kept a binder thick with protocols, and a chef whose job was complicated by Eleanor's habit of revising menus at the last instant. There was a gardener who knew the Latin names of everything and the precise shade of green Eleanor preferred. There were florists, drivers, vendors, and a security chief who pretended to be invisible. Staff shared a small kitchen off the service corridor and learned to stand in the doorway when conversations were personal so sound did not carry. They knew that questions could be interpreted as challenges. They realized that silence in certain rooms functioned as armor. Grace's work lived in the details guests never saw. She restored a duvet to the shape the laundress meant. She wiped a water ring before the light shifted and made it permanent. She kept a worn notebook in her apron pocket with small columns, items to restock, items to remove, moments to prepare. For? She observed without announcing her presence. She noticed that the ballroom felt colder in winter because the heat rose and the vents were disguised as panels. She noticed that the pantry was organized by a logic that reflected more than convenience, a taxonomy of preference. She noticed that Eleanor treated things as if they could read disappointment. The first signs that something in the household's equilibrium was failing appeared quietly. Richard began to look tired after dinner. At first, it might have been age or stress, the bloat of a day thick with meetings. Then the discomfort acquired edges. He excused himself with a hand pressed to his midsection. He returned pale. He slept badly and arrived at breakfast wan, recovered by noon. Then recovered, a little less the next day. Staff carried on, because a house like that required carrying on, no matter what human weather blew through it. Still, an uneasiness began to thread itself into the routine. The house manager adjusted schedules to accommodate late-night doctor. Visits that ended before anyone could say the word urgent out loud. Physicians came with luggage worth more than most cars. They brought tests and scented reassurances, along with a vocabulary of irritation, sensitivity, reflux, intolerance, an imbalance that could be coaxed back into equilibrium if only the right foods were consumed in the right combinations at the correct times. Eleanor stood beside them and asked precise questions about regimens. She had always been exacting about meals, but her oversight tightened into a grip that reached beyond preference. She reviewed ingredient deliveries and cross-checked oils, against a printout stored in a leather folio. She suggested substitutions and then pronounced them decisions. When the chef hesitated, she popped the lid herself, added a drizzle, a pinch, the kind of insistence that turns instructions into ownership. Grace watched the pattern build the way one watches weather on the horizon. She kept her face neutral while she noticed. The worst evenings followed a predictable sequence. Eleanor hovered in the kitchen near dessert, or near a nightcap meant to soothe. She left the room and returned. She tilted a jar close to her body while tasting. She asked Grace to carry the tray. After those nights, Richard's illness sharpened. The symptoms escalated to sweats that soaked a collar, shaking that moved across him like a wave. The staff responded with quiet efficiency, pulling curtains, calling the on-call doctor, setting out ginger ale and crackers that no one believed would matter. Hours later, the hallway would go silent again, and the morning would pretend nothing had happened. The house experienced denial as etiquette. The word pattern never found voice. It hovered like a scent in a room where windows stayed shut. To admit a pattern would be to admit suspicion, and suspicion did not go with the china. Eleanor performed, a concern in public, a performance many found moving. She guided Richard gently by the elbow at charity events, introducing him as stalwart and brave and praising his perseverance. Guests murmured approval. Photographers loved the image of devotion. Later, in private, she compartmentalized feelings into tasks. She was at her most powerful when she could manage variables. Her management of meals became total. Grace had known. Versions of this control her whole life. The way the veneer of kindness can cover a hierarchy that expects gratitude for the privilege of serving. She felt it when a boutique clerk shadowed her around the racks because she didn't look like a customer. She felt it when a neighbor told her, with a smile that was not a smile, that her family kept the block lively. She thought it now when Eleanor addressed her by the wrong name at luncheons, a tiny erasure repeated often enough to become a habit. She countered these erosions with a private ritual. She wrote the correct name in her notebook in neat, small letters. Naming is a way to insist on reality. Under the smooth schedule, the estate contained small resistances. The driver joked softly with Grace on the days he noticed Eleanor's tone sharpen toward her and softened when cameras arrived. The gardener left a bunch of herbs in a mason jar on the staff counter when he harvested too much. He offered her the jar first, a small act of decency that smelled like mint and soil. A night guard who had watched more doors than anyone else in the world once pulled the service entrance closed behind Grace with the lightest touch possible because he knew she was carrying too many things. None of this changed the architecture. It made it survivable. The pantry became a point of quiet attention. It was an immaculate room off the central kitchen, cool and faintly aromatic because of the stacked spices arranged by country. Labeled. Bins held grains, legumes, and seeds. Oils sat in a parade of glass, their colors running from pale straw to deep green. A small cabinet within the pantry locked softly when closed. The key hung on a hook that was used only by the chef and the house manager. One week in late spring, another small cabinet appeared, plain white, with a turn latch that looked decorative, until it clicked. Grace registered it like she registered weather. No comment, a note made in the margin of her mind. The household calendar swelled with events because wealth enjoys its own echoes. There were fundraisers, dinners, and golf tournaments that mainly existed to produce photographs of people being generous near a table the size of a wharf. On one of these nights, the mansion was adorned with tall arrangements of white flowers and soft lighting that cast a champagne hue over everything. Richard worked his way through the evening like a man moving underwater, smiling carefully, retreating to a quiet room for breath, returning with a face arranged to reassure. The chef served food engineered to comfort. Eleanor monitored the timing, as if conducting an orchestra. She insisted on an herbal infusion at the end of the meal, presented as a balm. Grace carried the porcelain pot with 2 hands. She delivered cups to the terrace. Later, in the half-dark of an upstairs hall, Richard leaned against a wall and closed his eyes in a way that frightened her more than the worst of the other nights. The doctors called it stress. They increased tests. They adjusted medications. They dismissed the timing as a coincidence because a coincidence is a convenient category, and the alternative is difficult to contemplate. The staff learned to keep extra linens within reach after dinner. They learned to leave the lower lights on. They knew how to look concerned without revealing fear. Grace learned that the words she most wanted to say had nowhere respectable to land. The structure of the house did not include a place for a black woman to voice a theory about harm in a way that would be considered objective. She had no evidence that could survive the standard of proof a woman like Eleanor required. She had a memory full of details and a heart trained to recognize uh-oh before it had a name. The estate's public face remained radiant. A magazine featured Eleanor in a spread about power couples, placing them in rooms that resembled monuments. The accompanying article praised their contributions to the city and printed a photograph of the kitchen's gleam. It did not mention the staff corridor or the small, careful economies that kept a world like this unwrinkled. It did not mention the quiet exhaustion that shadowed Richard's features or the way Grace had begun to measure her day in pulses of dread. It did not mention race at all, which is often how race operates when power is practiced by those who never have to say that word aloud. Grace's Sunday return home grew more precious. She moved through the small apartment in socks, listening to the kettle rattle, and let herself be ordinary. Her mother touched her face with the kind of tenderness that reminds a person she wasn't born to be useful. Her sister spread textbooks and described clinical rotations and color-coded schedules. Her brother joked about wires and breakers while providing minor repairs that improved the apartment's aging insides. They asked about work. Grace chose what to disclose and what to leave in the mansion where it belonged. She carried worry like luggage with a worn handle. She set it down for a day. She picked it up again on the bus back. Autumn arrived, crisp and quiet. Leaves in the estate fell in curated quantities. The days shortened. The dinners felt heavier, not in terms of their ingredients, but in their implications. Grace's notebook was filled with small arrows and circled nouns. She underlined the word timing twice. She noticed that after the chef began prepping earlier, Eleanor started to hover earlier, too. She noticed that the new white cabinet in the pantry acquired an amber bottle and a tiny spoon. She noticed that the dog, an old Labrador with a patient face, sniffed once near the garbage and sneezed as if dust rose. The sneezing meant nothing, but it also meant something. When the world is whispering, a sneeze feels like a line of text. There was a night in late October when the power flickered. It lasted only a breath, and most people might have missed it, but machines do not lie. The refrigerator beeped. The stove clock reset. Later, the electrician explained that a transformer down the road hiccuped and returned. During that breath, the cameras along the service hallway went dark and then bright again. The gap was no longer than the span of a sigh. Afterward, in the bright kitchen, Eleanor insisted on brewing her own tea because a personal touch can oversell innocence. Richard drank. He smiled wearily. He stood. He steadied himself against a chair. The room remained silent in the way rooms remain silent when everyone agrees to ignore the obvious. The body resists being choreographed. Richard's illness refused to keep a polite schedule. It began to arrive earlier in the evening, intruding. On meetings at home, on calls with Europe, and on the time reserved for quiet reading that once calmed him. The house manager reorganized the calendar again, shifting external obligations to mornings, carving out afternoons for rest. Eleanor accepted adjustments as if they were her design. She insisted that rituals be preserved. Anything less looked like surrender. She avoided the word decline the way she avoided clashing colors. The idea that chaos could seep into a system built to prevent it offended her. Grace returned to the pantry and looked at the labels without touching them. She observed the drawer where the measuring spoons were stored and noted that the tiny spoon, which had appeared with the amber bottle, was rinsed more often than it had reason to be. She was not the chef. She did not control the ingredients. She did not have authority. Authority is a ladder with rungs spaced for certain bodies. What she had instead was a quiet kind of vigilance and a conscience that refused to lie down. She began creating mental maps of her interactions. She rehearsed the question she could never ask. How do you protect a person who does not yet know he needs protecting from someone who, by all appearances, protects him? Eleanor's social calendar is filled with winter benefits. She wore cool colors and looked luminous under chandeliers. She clasped Richard's hand a breath longer for photographs. She cultivated narratives that stabilized her image: generosity, perseverance, taste. The circles she moved in affirmed her performance because to confess suspicion would require them to interrogate too much else. They could not risk it. To maintain the comfort of the room, everything unpleasant needed an alternate explanation. Stress is convenient. Fragility is convenient. Biology misbehaving is convenient. Malice is inconvenient. On a weekday evening with no guests expected, a modest dinner presented itself: a clear soup, a small fish, and lightly dressed greens. It was the kind of meal recommended by people who use the word cleanse as if it were a verb that could absolve. The kitchen smelled like lemon. Grace laid the table with placemats instead of linens because informality sometimes passes for intimacy. Eleanor appeared in soft cashmere and a neutral expression with a look of concentration. She stepped into the kitchen twice and returned to the dining room with the air of a person who regards the universe as correctable. After the meal, the house fell into its quiet, and then the silence was shattered. Richard's body rebelled in a way that was impossible to categorize as indigestion. The physician came, then another, then a specialist, all of them speaking a language that sounded like caution disguised as confidence. The staff gathered, but did not gather, because visibility is not always a guarantee of safety. The hours lengthened into something that felt like a warning. Morning found the house bleached by winter light. The fountain pooled still and gray. A flock of small birds landed startled and lifted again. The newspaper headlines arranged on the dining table concerned markets and manufacturing indexes, as well as a politician's misstep. They did not concern themselves with the house's interior weather. They did not record the way Grace carried the tray to the study and set it down, and saw, out of the corner of her eye, the residue of something along the lip of a cup no one had used since last night. She straightened the sugar bowl. She adjusted the flowers. She left the room with her heart beating as if she had been running. The day continued. The mansion required continuing. The chef planned lunch. The gardener mapped winter pruning. The house manager scheduled an HVAC inspection to ensure warmth could be maintained with greater reliability. Eleanor retreated to a sitting room at the back of the house and made calls that sounded like power and looked like care. She controlled variables because variables were a kind of enemy. She moved through rooms in which everything matched because matching soothes fear. She did not appear to be the type of person who could pose a danger to anyone else. Appearances are structures that hold up beliefs until they become load-bearing. Grace stood in the service corridor and realized that her quiet was starting to feel like complicity. The pattern pressed against her. Her own history pressed against her. The part that knew how easily a black woman's observation can be reinterpreted as overstepping. How swiftly a suggestion offered to protect can be read as an accusation meant to disrupt. She understood how punishment can be subtle. Fewer hours, a colder tone, the invitation to leave without being fired. She also understood what it would mean to do nothing and watch the arc of this story bend, as stories like this often do when nobody interrupts them. She began to prepare in the ways available to her. She sharpened her attention into a tool. She rearranged her duties to be present near the kitchen during transitions. She memorized the small cabinet and the way its latch clicked. She noted that the amber bottle remained, that the tiny spoon disappeared and returned, and that the tea towels near the kettle smelled faintly bitter on nights when the kitchen had otherwise been washed to the point of absence. She wrote the word observe in her notebook and underlined it so lightly that the page barely dented. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the staff sink and reminded herself that caution is not the same as fear. The estate prepared for winter holidays with the mindless optimism of tradition. Trees arrived wrapped in netting and unfolded, themselves in rooms selected by height. Boxes of ornaments appeared from storage like memories. Candles multiplied. Menus proliferated. There would be parties again, because parties help families convince themselves that continuity equals safety. Grace polished silver until her hands ached, and the trays shone like small moons. She moved quietly and imagined a near future in which her suspicions were proven imaginary, in which the illness resolved, in which the house resumed its unruffled routine. She also imagined a near future in which she would need courage that felt larger than her body. On a late afternoon that carried the peculiar hush of snow coming, Grace paused on the landing halfway up the back staircase and listened. Sounds travel, differently when everyone is pretending not to make any. She heard the soft thud of a cabinet closing and the whisper of a kettle not yet singing. She heard footsteps crossing tile, a pause, a return. She descended, not quickly and not slowly, and entered the kitchen carrying a basket of folded napkins as if the napkins were the only story. She placed them in a drawer. She turned to the sink. She did nothing unusual except exist inside a choice that would shape everything that followed. In that poised and polished house, the tiniest shifts, one person lingering a moment longer, one person looking too closely, contain the energy of earthquakes no one hears until the shelves begin to tremble. Grace could feel the tremor in the way her pulse settled into steadiness. She understood that what she had been hired to do and what she might have to do next were no longer the same task. She did not yet know that she would become the fulcrum between harm and survival. She only knew that normal life had shrunk around a set of rituals that hurt someone, and rituals that hurt someone cannot be called normal, no matter how beautiful the room that hosts them. By nightfall, snow had started, a thin sift that softened the edges of everything. The fountain's surface turned satin, the hedges looked powdered. Inside, lights glowed against windows, duplicating rooms in glass. The mansion seemed to float in its own reflection. Richard moved slowly through a hallway, careful and polite in his own house, as if unwilling to cause the air trouble. Eleanor sat in a chair by the fire, the picture of composure, planning the next day in her head the way an executive plans a quarter. The staff kept time. The kitchen warmed. A kettle began to purl. The smallest spoon waited in a drawer with its clean shine. Grace stood between the pantry and the doorway that led to the dining room and understood that the distance between noticing and acting had become very, very small. The house did not know it yet, but the season of pretending was running out. There is a point past which even the most disciplined surfaces cannot absorb what presses beneath. There is a moment when the sound a latch makes becomes evidence, and the way a hand hovers above a cup becomes a question that will not be swallowed. In that moment, still technically belonging to the mansion's ordinary life, the story took its real shape, an arc drawing itself toward a revelation that would not be contained by etiquette. The Black Maid, trained by a lifetime of reading rooms with care, stepped into her next task. The billionaire, who had built systems to protect him from every kind of volatility except the intimate kind, moved 1 hour closer to a truth no doctor had diagnosed. And the wife, whose control soothed her the way certain songs soothe, tightened her grip without noticing that the rope she pulled was fraying. What looked like a normal evening began. It would not end that way. The first true fracture in the facade of the Winslow estate came on a night that should have been uneventful. No guests, no reporters, no obligations, just dinner for two. The chef prepared a simple chicken dish, seasoned lightly, accompanied by greens and roasted potatoes. Grace moved efficiently, placing silverware, aligning glasses, arranging linen napkins into their folded triangles. Everything was routine until Eleanor appeared in the kitchen. She was dressed not for dinner but for performance. Silk blouse, pearls at her neck, a faint perfume that filled the air before her words did. With a serene smile, she dismissed the chef. "I'll finish this," she said, her voice smooth but brooking no refusal. The chef hesitated, exchanged a glance with Grace, and retreated. Grace remained, folding napkins in the corner, her hands steady though her stomach twisted. Eleanor took over the finishing touches, spooning sauce with delicate precision. Then came the tea, always the tea. Eleanor insisted it soothed Richard's stomach. She brewed it herself, hovering by the kettle until steam curled like ghostly fingers into the air. When she placed the cup on the tray, she lifted it with a carefulness that looked more like possession than service. Grace carried the tray to the dining hall. She set it down before Richard, who looked weary but grateful. His smile was faint, his eyes shadowed. He drank the tea slowly, wincing slightly after each sip. Eleanor watched him with an intensity that made Grace's skin prickle. Hours later, Grace heard it again, the groaning, the retching, the sound of a body revolting against itself. Richard collapsed onto his bed, clammy and trembling. Doctors rushed in, speaking in hushed tones about possible ulcers, stress-induced reactions, maybe even early signs of something more sinister. Eleanor clutched his hand dramatically, her face a mask of anguish. To anyone else it might have looked like devotion. To Grace, standing quietly in the doorway, it looked like possession. The pattern hardened over the following weeks. Richard grew weaker, his illnesses striking with alarming consistency after meals. Eleanor grew more controlling, often dismissing staff from the kitchen to ensure everything was prepared exactly right. She attended to Richard with exaggerated tenderness, adjusting his pillows, smoothing his blankets, hovering like a shadow that never left. The staff whispered in the corridors. The gardener told Grace he'd overheard Eleanor on the phone, her voice low, speaking of Richard's fragility as if it were an asset. The chauffeur muttered about canceled meetings, wondering aloud if Richard was losing his grip on his empire. No one dared speak louder than a whisper. In that household, whispers could cost jobs. Grace, however, noticed more than the others. She saw how Eleanor's eyes sharpened when Richard winced, how her lips pressed thin when he praised Grace for her attentiveness. She noticed that Eleanor always prepared the tea herself, no matter how small the gathering. She noticed the amber bottle tucked away in the new white cabinet of the pantry, a bottle she never saw in use except on nights when Richard's sickness worsened. The silence pressed on her like a weight. She wanted to speak, but to whom? Richard was too weak, too trusting. The staff was too afraid. The doctors were too convinced by Eleanor's curated narrative. Grace was just the maid, a black maid in a house where her word carried less weight than the gleam of Eleanor's pearls. Still, she began to keep a secret log. Each episode, each meal, each night, Eleanor brewed tea. Grace recorded it all in her small notebook. The dates lined up with precision, a pattern undeniable to her, though invisible to everyone else. Meanwhile, the world outside the estate began to notice Richard's decline. Business reporters speculated on his absence from conferences. Board members whispered about succession plans. Competitors circled like vultures sensing vulnerability. Yet, in public appearances carefully orchestrated by Eleanor, Richard appeared with her by his side, smiling weakly, a hand clasping hers as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. Eleanor leaned into her role. She positioned herself as the devoted wife, the caretaker, the woman holding the empire together. She made speeches in his stead, dropped subtle hints about his fragility while emphasizing her own steadiness. Society praised her. The press adored her. And in the shadows of that glowing image, Richard grew sicker. Grace watched it all with a tightening chest. She saw the disconnect, the image of strength Eleanor projected versus the reality of Richard writhing in pain after dinner. She wanted to shout the truth, but the mansion's walls absorbed every scream before it could form. One night, something unusual happened. Eleanor entered the kitchen later than usual, already flustered. She reached for the amber bottle in the pantry and, in her haste, dropped the tiny spoon. It clattered to the floor. Grace, polishing silver nearby, bent to pick it up. For a split second, their eyes locked. Eleanor's hand snapped out, snatching the spoon before Grace's fingers touched it. "Leave it," Eleanor said sharply, her voice cutting through the air like glass. Then, just as quickly, she softened her tone. "It's delicate. I'll handle it." Grace nodded silently, but her mind raced. That spoon, that bottle, it wasn't just a suspicion anymore. Something was being added, something deliberate. That night, Richard's illness was worse than ever. He vomited until his body convulsed, his skin pale as bone. Doctors once again blamed stress. Eleanor wrung her hands, her performance flawless. Grace stood in the corner, trembling, her notebook burning like a secret she was no longer sure she could carry. Grace's growing awareness of danger collided with another reality she knew too well, the racism embedded in her daily life. Eleanor wielded it like a weapon, subtle but constant. When guests were present, Eleanor would introduce her as the girl who helps us around the house, never by name. When Richard complimented Grace's efficiency, Eleanor would add, "Yes, she's well trained." At luncheons, Eleanor's friends made offhand remarks. "She must be grateful to be here, working in such a fine home." Or, "You're lucky Eleanor gives you such opportunities." Grace smiled politely, swallowing her pride, but each comment was a reminder that in this house she was tolerated, not respected. And yet, Grace knew that her position, the position of a black maid, was precisely why she could see the truth so clearly. She was invisible enough to witness what others ignored, overlooked enough to notice details that those in power dismissed. The same prejudice that diminished her also gave her eyes sharper than anyone else's in the mansion. As the weeks passed, Grace's suspicion hardened into certainty. Eleanor was poisoning Richard, slowly, methodically, hidden beneath the guise of care. It wasn't clumsy or obvious, it was calculated, disguised in teas and soups, masked by the language of wellness. The wow. Realization left Grace sleepless. She lay awake in her small room, the hum of the estate faint around her, and wrestled with fear. If she spoke up, would anyone believe her? Or would Eleanor turn suspicion against her, framing her as the jealous, untrustworthy maid? The history of women like Grace told her the answer. Her word would not carry the same weight. It could even cost her everything. But silence was no longer possible. Each day, Richard grew weaker. Each day, his life hung more precariously in the balance. Grace's notebook filled with evidence, but evidence in her hands meant little in a world designed to dismiss her. She needed more. She needed proof no one could ignore. One evening, Grace made a decision that terrified her. When Eleanor prepared the tea, Grace lingered nearby, watching closely. As Eleanor turned her back, Grace slipped a napkin under the cup before carrying it out. Later, when no one was watching, she dabbed the rim of the cup with the napkin, folding it carefully and tucking it into her notebook. It was a small act, reckless and dangerous. If caught, she could lose her job, her livelihood, even her safety. But it was also the first tangible step toward uncovering the truth. She told herself it was just a precaution, just in case. But in her heart, she knew it was more. It was a declaration, however silent, that she would not allow Richard to die under her watch. As if sensing Grace's quiet rebellion, the atmosphere in the mansion grew more oppressive. Eleanor's eyes lingered on her longer, her questions sharper, her commands colder. "Don't meddle in things you don't understand," she said once, her smile too thin, too knowing. Grace felt a chill crawl down her spine. Did Eleanor suspect? Richard's illness deepened. He lost weight, his movements slow, his once commanding voice reduced to a whisper. The empire he had built began to wobble without him, and Eleanor stepped in with growing authority. She wasn't just the caretaker anymore, she was the de facto ruler, making decisions in Richard's name, consolidating power with every signature. And through it all, Grace kept watching, waiting, gathering pieces of a puzzle too dark to ignore. Then, one night, it happened. Richard sat down to dinner, weary but trying to mask it. Eleanor insisted on a new herbal blend she had discovered. Grace carried the cup as always, but her hands trembled slightly. Richard drank. Minutes later, he clutched his chest, gasping for air, collapsing against the table. The mansion erupted into chaos. Staff screamed, doctors were summoned. Eleanor shrieked with convincing despair. But in the storm of panic, Grace's eyes locked on the cup, the faint residue clinging to its rim. And in that moment she knew the time for silence had ended. The truth was clawing its way to the surface, and Grace was the only one who could drag it fully into the light. The night Richard collapsed at the dining table, the mansion transformed into a war zone of panic. Footsteps thundered across marble floors, voices clashed, and urgent calls were made. Richard lay pale, gasping, his body trembling as if his very life force were draining from him in real time. Eleanor played her role flawlessly. She cried out for help, clutched at his hand, wailed to the doctors that her beloved husband was slipping away. She clung to him so tightly it was as though she meant to anchor herself more than save him. But Grace stood apart, frozen and burning, at once. Her eyes locked not on Eleanor's performance, but on the teacup, the faint residue clinging to its porcelain edge, the amber bottle she knew would be waiting in the pantry. Every detail screamed the truth she had been piecing together for months. And now Richard's shallow breathing confirmed what she dreaded. If no one acted, he would not survive another night. Doctors rushed Richard upstairs, their words a blur. Arrhythmia, toxin, dehydration. Eleanor followed, her sobs echoing against the grand staircase. Staff scattered, some in panic, some in quiet resignation. Only Grace remained still, rooted to the spot where Richard had fallen. Her notebook pressed against her chest like a secret weapon, her napkin sample hidden deep inside its pages. The house grew eerily quiet once Richard was stabilized in his bed. Machines beeped, doctors whispered, Eleanor hovered. Grace retreated, to her quarters, her heart pounding, her mind spinning. The choice that had tormented her for weeks now became unavoidable. Speak and risk everything, or stay silent and let Richard die. She pulled out the notebook, flipping through pages filled with dates, notes, observations. It was more than a log. It was a chronicle of a murder unfolding in slow motion. She stared at the folded napkin tucked inside. Proof. Proof no one could deny. But in whose hands would it matter? The word of a black maid against the matriarch, of one of the city's most powerful families? Still, the weight of conscience crushed her. If she did nothing, she would carry the guilt forever. She would hear Richard's groans in her dreams, see his pale face in every reflection. The following morning, Eleanor descended the stairs in a gown of soft silk, her hair immaculate, her eyes framed by shadows that seemed deliberate. She looked, every inch the grieving wife, though her husband still clung to life upstairs. She dismissed staff with a wave of her hand, ordering quiet and control. Grace, clutching her notebook, stepped into the dining hall. The decision had already been made in her heart. "Mrs. Winslow," she said softly, her voice steady though her hands shook, "I need to speak with you." Eleanor turned, her expression unreadable. "What is it, Grace?" she asked, her tone sharp beneath the sweetness. Grace took a breath. "I know what's happening to Mr. Winslow. I've seen the pattern, the teas, the soups. I've kept record, and I have proof." She pulled the notebook slightly into view, the folded napkin tucked inside. For a flicker of a second, Eleanor's eyes hardened. The mask slipped. Her smile thinned into something cold, reptilian. Then, just as quickly, the mask returned. "You're confused, dear," Eleanor said, stepping closer, her voice laced with a venomous calm. "You've been working too hard. Stress makes people imagine things." Grace held her ground, though fear coiled around her spine. "This isn't imagination. You're hurting him. And if I don't do something, he's going to die." The air between them thickened. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a whisper that chilled the room. "Do you think anyone will believe you, Grace? You, a maid, a black maid in a house that does not belong to you. Do you think the world will side with you against me?" The words landed like a slap, brutal in their naked prejudice. Eleanor wasn't hiding anymore. She didn't need to. She knew the imbalance of power. She knew the system was tilted in her favor. But Grace's fear turned to fire. Her entire life, she had faced this dismissal, this erasure. And here it was again, sharpened into a weapon. But this time, it wasn't just about her dignity. It was about a man's life. "I don't care if they believe me," Grace said, her voice rising. "I know the truth. And I won't stay silent." The confrontation spiraled into a storm. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice sharp and venomous. "You think you matter here? You're replaceable, disposable. One word from me and you'll never work again. You'll crawl back to whatever gutter you came from." Grace's hands trembled, but she lifted the notebook higher, her voice steady. "Then explain this. Dates, times, details, and this—" She unfolded the napkin slightly. "With traces of whatever. You've been slipping into his tea. You can silence me, Mrs. Winslow, but you can't silence the truth." For the first time, Eleanor faltered. Her face froze, eyes darting to the napkin, then back to Grace. The mask cracked wide enough to expose the truth Grace had always suspected. Eleanor knew she had been caught, but Eleanor recovered quickly, her smile returning, brittle but dangerous. "You're playing a dangerous game, Grace," she whispered. "And games like this don't end well for people like you." The words dripped with menace, but Grace didn't back down. She turned, clutching the notebook, and left the dining hall. Each step away from Eleanor felt like walking through fire, but she refused to turn back. That night, Richard's condition worsened again. His breathing was ragged, his pulse faint. Doctors muttered about possible poisoning, but hesitated to accuse. Eleanor hovered as always, her hand resting dramatically on his forehead. Grace couldn't take it anymore. She stepped into the room, clutching the notebook. "Check his tea," she said, her voice breaking through the tense silence. "Check it now. You'll find what's making him sick." The doctors turned, startled. Eleanor's eyes flashed with fury, but Grace pressed on, her voice fierce. "I've been keeping track. Every time he drinks what she prepares, he ends up like this. Look at the patterns. Test it." For a moment, the room froze. Then, one of the younger doctors, less bound by loyalty, less cowed by Eleanor's power, asked, quietly, "Do you have proof?" Grace opened the notebook. She showed them the dates, the times, the samples she had hidden. The room buzzed with unease, doctors exchanging glances. Eleanor's composure cracked again, her face twisting into something darker. "You dare accuse me?" she hissed, her voice low but seething. "In my own house?" But the seed had been planted. The doctors could no longer ignore the possibility. They took the cup, the residue, the napkin sample. Eleanor tried to intervene, but this time her protests sounded desperate, shrill. The balance of power shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Hours later, the tests came back. Elevated levels of toxins, unmistakable. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to weaken, to sicken, to break a man down over time. The whispers turned into certainty. The doctors confronted Eleanor quietly, their faces grim. Richard, barely conscious, stirred at the sound. Grace stood. At the edge of the room, her heart pounding, tears stinging her eyes. She had been right. The truth had clawed its way into the light. But the victory was not sweet. Eleanor's eyes found hers across the room, burning with hatred. It wasn't over. Grace knew it in her bones. Eleanor would not go down quietly, and in that stare lay a promise. This fight had only just begun. The climax ended with the truth finally breaking through the walls of silence, but the cost was heavy and the danger far from over. Eleanor was unmasked, but she was powerful, cunning, and cornered. And for Grace, the act of speaking truth to power had placed her directly in the line of fire. Dear audience, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps. The morning after the toxicology results shattered Eleanor's performance of devotion, the Winslow estate no longer felt like the sanctuary of wealth and prestige it once pretended to be. It was a battlefield, silent, tense, and waiting for the next move. Doctors had confirmed what Grace's notebook had long screamed. Richard Winslow's body bore the burden of deliberate poisoning. Not accidental, not environmental. Deliberate. Eleanor's denial came swift and vicious. She called the doctors liars, accused Grace of planting evidence, even wept in front of Richard's weakened frame, as though betrayal cut her deeper than the man's frailty. Her words were sharp, her voice rising to a pitch that rattled chandeliers. But the evidence was no longer whisper-thin. It had substance now, numbers on reports, traces in cups, a trail that pointed only to her. When Richard regained clearer consciousness days later, the first sight he saw was Eleanor at his bedside. She held his hand tenderly, her eyes glistening with crocodile tears. She whispered about his illness, about how she had been his rock, about how others were trying to drive a wedge between them. But Richard, weakened though he was, carried decades of boardroom instincts. He recognized manipulation. He saw shadows of doubt creeping into her performance. And then his gaze shifted to Grace, standing in the corner, silent but unflinching. Grace did not speak, but her presence screamed volumes. She had risked everything to save him. Her courage had pierced through layers of privilege and deception. When Eleanor left the room briefly, Richard beckoned Grace closer with a trembling hand. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You knew?" Grace nodded. "I couldn't stay silent, sir. Not when your life was at stake." His eyes softened, though exhaustion weighed them down. He squeezed her hand faintly, a silent acknowledgement of gratitude. The unraveling of Eleanor Winslow happened faster than anyone expected. Once the truth left the walls of the mansion, it became too heavy to contain. Doctors filed reports, board members whispered of scandal, the press caught scent of a story too salacious to ignore. The image of Eleanor, the elegant benefactor, the noble caretaker, fractured. Questions surfaced about her motives, her control over Richard's empire, her desire for full power. Law enforcement arrived discreetly but firmly. Eleanor's protests filled the estate, echoing through the halls as she was questioned, then escorted away. Her pearl necklace glimmered under the harsh light of flashing cameras. For many, it was a shocking revelation. For Grace, it was confirmation of what she had lived with in silence, the danger of prejudice wrapped in privilege. Eleanor had dismissed her as invisible, expendable, powerless. Yet it was the maid, the overlooked black woman in the corner, who had uncovered the truth that none of Eleanor's friends, allies, or admirers dared to see. In the days that followed, Richard's health slowly improved under proper care. Poison cleared from his system, strength returning inch by inch. The empire he had built trembled but held, bolstered by loyal board members who rallied now that Eleanor's grip had weakened. And Grace? For the first time, she stepped out of the shadows. Staff whispered her name not as the help, but as the woman who had saved the master's life. Newspapers speculated about the maid who saw what no one else would. Richard's lawyers asked for her records, her notebook, her testimony. Yet, alongside recognition came the sting of prejudice. Some commentators framed her as opportunistic. Eleanor's defenders painted her as a liar seeking attention. Anonymous letters arrived at the estate, dripping with racist venom. Stay in your place. You'll regret crossing her. Know your role. Grace endured it all with quiet dignity. She hadn't spoken out for fame or recognition. She had spoken out because conscience demanded it. She carried herself with the same steadiness she had on her first day at the Winslow mansion, but now her eyes carried fire instead of resignation. Richard, recovering in his study weeks later, summoned Grace privately. His frame was still frail, but his voice had regained some of its command. He thanked her, not with extravagance, not with spectacle, but with sincerity. "You saved my life," he said simply. Grace nodded, her response humble yet resolute. "I only did what was right." Richard's gaze dropped, his tone turning heavy. "And yet, it should not have fallen to you. The people I trusted failed me, the doctors, the board, even myself. But you saw, because you were forced to see what others ignored." His words lingered, a quiet acknowledgement of both gratitude and guilt. Gratitude for her courage, guilt for the blind spots of privilege that had made her both invisible and essential. Grace's story was not just about poison in teacups. It was about poison in society, the slow, suffocating toxin of racism that dismissed her voice until it became undeniable. Eleanor had counted on that silence. She had counted on Grace being too powerless to challenge her. But Grace had broken that silence. And in doing so, she exposed more than Eleanor's crime. She exposed how easily the world accepts lies when spoken by those in power, and how stubbornly it resists truth when it comes from those pushed to the margins. The Winslow estate, once a fortress of wealth, now bore scars of scandal. Its marble halls whispered a new story. Not of luxury, but of how one woman's courage saved a man from both poison and the prejudice that nearly allowed it to succeed. Months later, as Richard regained his footing in business and Eleanor awaited trial, Grace continued her work at the estate, not out of servitude, but out of choice. Richard insisted on her promotion, her protection, her recognition, but Grace, true to herself, remained humble. She did not seek spotlight or grandeur. She sought only justice and peace for her family. Her mother's medical bills were paid in full, her sister's education secured through Richard's quiet generosity. Grace accepted the help, but not as charity. She accepted it as acknowledgement, a small repayment for the dignity denied to her for so long. And yet, Grace knew the fight was bigger than one mansion, one family, one act of justice. Racism did not end because Eleanor was exposed. Prejudice did not vanish because Grace was vindicated. The poison still lingered in society's veins. But Grace also knew something else. Silence could be broken. Truth could pierce through walls of privilege. and even the most overlooked voices could change the course of lives. In the end, the Winslow scandal became more than a headline. It became a parable, a reminder that power corrupts, prejudice blinds, and truth often comes from those least expected to speak it. Grace Daniels, once invisible, had become the unlikely force that unmasked deceit at the highest level. Her story was not just about a billionaire poisoned by his wife. It was about the toxins we tolerate when we ignore voices silenced by race, class, and power. And so the mansion that once gleamed with wealth now carried a different glow, the faint light of truth breaking through shadows. Because sometimes the deadliest poisons are not the ones slipped into teacups, but the ones society swallows when it dismisses voices like Grace's. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and new videos.